Hey everyone, this is Teresa from Base 10 Montessori, and today I am bringing you Chapter 7 of the Absorbent Mind, and that chapter is called The Spiritual Embryo. And just to give you a little bit of background on my first experience with this chapter, this is kind of usually where I put the Absorbent Mind book down and didn't go back to it for a really long time. So when I was an assistant and I was just starting in Montessori, um, I think in 2013, I tried to read The Absorbent Mind, and I kind of would skip over the biology stuff, and then I'd get to chapter 7 on the spiritual embryo, and then I would just kind of quit, and I'm like, never mind, right? But when I decided to go to training, I thought, well, goodness, I really need to read The Absorbent Mind. Now I have to come back to it. I need to push through it, even if some things don't make sense. And even then, right before training, I kind of skipped through the spiritual embryo, not so much skipped, but kind of pushed through it without paying too much of attention to it. And now that I'm coming back to it as a trained professional, having some experience using the method after being trained, I was amazed to find just how important this chapter was. And I think one of the reasons why it didn't appeal to me a long time ago, like 10 years ago, is because there are a lot of unusual terms in here. There are a lot of words in here that you kind of have to say, what is she talking about? I don't really understand all these weird terms that she's using. So it's hard to process that. If you don't understand the terminology, it gets difficult to read the chapter. And so I hopefully today what I can do as we're going through this chapter is begin to explain to you some of these words in a way that makes sense, that makes the chapter a little more accessible. So that's one goal I'm going to have for approaching this chapter, but also this is kind of a long chapter and it has a lot of important information in it. And I debated whether or not I should break this up into different parts and release it in one or two parts or three parts. And then I decided, you know what, I'm just going to put chapters in. So if you don't want to listen to this all at once, or if you're looking at it and think, oh, I'm never going to make it through this video. I'm interested in the topic, but this is just way too much of me listening to somebody talk about things that I'm not sure I fully understand. I totally understand where you're coming from, and I'm going to put chapter markers in the video so that you can skip around or find your place. So if you only want to listen to one part at a time, maybe it'll be a little bit easier to digest in small increments. So look for those chapter markers in the video so that you can have a little bit of an easier time navigating this video if it seems to go on too long. So with that being said, I do want to move on to my first slide. And we're going to come back to the slide a few different times. I'm going to keep coming back to it because this is where it gets a little bit tricky for this chapter. So the first term that I want to introduce you to is the Mneme. And the Mneme is this vital kind of memory, and I think we've talked about this in other videos before, if you remember. It's a vital kind of memory which does not consciously remember, but absorbs images into the individual's very life. And so she says that on page 53. And so it's this unconscious memory, and if this sounds kind of familiar, it's because she was very much influenced by Freudian theory, and we're going to get a little more into that later on. And then there's the important word Horme, which is this creative energy. So when we're talking about the Horme, we're talking about a creative energy. If you don't understand the context for that right now, don't worry. We'll get into that a little more later, but just kind of keep in mind that word translates to creative energy. Then the Nebulae corresponds to the awakening of what are called behavior instincts in the animals. And it happens in the first few days of life, those which mental hygiene is obliged to regard as the most important. So for short, let's just call the nebulae potentialities. So when you're thinking of that, think about all the potentialities of the child. So that's what I want you to keep in mind. So we've got Horme, which is that creative energy, the nebulae, which are these potentialities. We've got the Mneme, which is that unconscious memory. And then we have the name of the chapter is called the spiritual embryo. Now, sometimes this is also called the psychic embryo, and I've made a lot of videos relating to the spiritual embryo or the psychic embryo. And every time I bring up the word psychic or spiritual in those terms, I have to define it as, it's not this supernatural thing. What she's really talking to when she's talking about the psychic or the spiritual aspect, it's the mental organs, that mental component of development, as well as a spiritual component, because Maria Montessori did believe in that spiritual side, that there is a spiritual side of life. So the spiritual embryo is the period after birth where the child's mental functions are forming and connecting to the body. So you have the child developing in the womb, and you've got this limited mental life going on in the womb, right? The child's body is forming, the organs are forming, all that is happening inside the womb. And then the mental components, the structures are there, but they're not really fully formed yet, right? But after birth, they begin to come together. And this is what we call the spiritual embryo in Montessori. And then, of course, we have the Freudian theory of the unconscious mind, which most of us know about. Most of us are very familiar with Freud's work. But I want to look at it real quick in terms of Maria Montessori. So Sigmund Freud, he lived from 1856 to 1939. And in comparison to Maria Montessori, she lived 1870 to 1952. So there's a lot of overlap with their lives there. And so for most of us, we understand a lot about what Freud talked about, but let's have a little reminder here. And this quote comes from Paula Polk Lillard in her book about Maria Montessori. And she said, Freud's discoveries had stimulated interest in infancy and early childhood in the early 1900s. The emphasis, however, was on emotional, not intellectual development. So there's a little bit of a difference going on there. We've been studying a lot of intellectual development, but now Freud is coming along, and he's developing this emotional development. And Freud also developed a theory of sensitive periods in early childhood, which Dr. Montessori further developed in her educational methods. And this is stated again by Paula Polk Lillard. And if you remember correctly, the Montessori sensitive periods, which only happen in that 0 to 6 age group, are order, language, refinement of movement, and refinement of the senses. So we've got those 4 sensitive periods. And so that also relates back to Freud as well. And Dr. Montessori also wrote extensively on the impact of the unconscious mind and the role of fantasy during the first plane of development. And if you're curious about fantasy and imagination, I have a video on it. It's one of my first videos, so I did it a long time ago. So you'll have to scroll down on my YouTube page to find it, but it's still there. I might have to redo that video someday, but it's there if you want to see it. And it talks a lot about Montessori's views of imagination. So that's kind of how Montessori and Freud fit together as far as theory goes. Now let's actually start getting into the chapter. And as soon as we come upon one of those more complicated terms that we read at the beginning, we'll go back and we can look at the definition again, because it does get a little bit tricky to remember all these different weird terms that we don't use really in our modern life now. So my chapter starts on page 53. And page 53, she says, there is a period of life different from that which he led in the womb, yet still unlike that of the man he is to become. The postnatal work is a constructive activity which is carried on in what may be called the formative period, and it makes the baby into a kind of spiritual embryo. So she says there are 2 embryonic periods. There's a prenatal one, and then there is a postnatal one. And she says that the prolonged infancy of man separates him entirely from the animals. And that's an interesting thought to think about, right? How do we differ from animals? Well, we have a very long infancy. We have this long childhood compared to the animal kingdom. So that's an interesting observation she makes there. And she says his powers are neither continuations nor derivations from those of the animals. What causes us to distinguish between species are always their differences, never their likenesses. What constitutes another species is always something new. And so she's looking at those differences here, and she said, okay, we need to look at what makes us different. And so by looking at what makes us different from the animal kingdom, she was able to come up with more of her theories on what is going on at birth. Why are we so different? And that's where it all really begins, with this idea of the spiritual embryo. And on page 54, she says, this is the point at which we must pause and make a fresh start in all our studies of child development and of man on his psychological side. So again, when we're talking about this psychic embryo, we're talking about the spiritual embryo, we're talking about man and his psychological side, the spiritual side. If the work of man on the earth is related to his spirit, to his creative intelligence, then his spirit and his intelligence must be the fulcrum of his existence and of all the workings of his body. And then she goes on to say that this developing child not only acquires the faculties of man, but at the same time, he adapts the being he is constructing to the conditions of the world about him. And this is a really important concept in Montessori, the importance of the environment. So we have this nature versus nurture thing going on, and the biology really focused on that nature part. Now we're kind of focusing a lot on this, the nurture part, right? The environment part. And she says, the things he sees are not just remembered. They form part of his soul. He incarnates in himself all in the world about him that his eyes see and his ears hear. In us, the same thing produces no change, but the child is transformed by them. So here she's talking about the impact, the importance of the environment on the child. And he doesn't just have an unconscious mind, right? There's not this unconscious memory. It's that the child works this memory, this experience into himself, into his development, into his soul, into his personality. And that is why the environment is so important, especially that period right after birth, that period that we're calling the spiritual embryo, or the psychic embryo, as sometimes it's called. Then on page 55, she gives an example of language. She says the child does not remember sounds, but he incarnates them and can then reproduce them to perfection. He speaks his language according to its complex rules with all their exceptions, not because he has studied it, nor by the ordinary use of memory. The language is something that Montessori will keep coming back to throughout the book to show just how powerful this time of life is in that 0 to 6 age group. And language is an extraordinary example of what's going on in development and in terms of how the child is developing his mind and his potentialities. She says there is a special kind of sensitivity which leads him to absorb everything about him. And it is this work of observing and absorbing that alone enables him to adapt himself to life. He does it in virtue of an unconscious power that only exists in childhood. The first period of the child's life is one of adaptation. A grown-up who lives abroad never adapts his life in the same way and to the same degree. So this spiritual embryo, this time right after birth, and then this development that happens during the 0 to 6 age group is extremely special, and it's not something that can be repeated later on in life. And that sets the foundation for what she's going to go on to say about how special this time period is, and just how much we have to dedicate the world to making sure that this is a protected time of life, that this is a very protected experience for the child. And on page 56, she says, nothing has more importance for us than this absorbent form of mind, which shapes the adult and adapts him to any kind of social order, climate, or country. On this, the whole of our study is based. He develops a behavior not only adapted to this time and region, but also to the local mentality. These mental characteristics seem to be hereditary, but really, they are infantile formations derived from the child's surroundings. So again, we're getting into this nature versus nurture debate. How much does each determine, right? How much does nature determine? How much does nurture determine? And so on pages 56 to 57, she really goes on to give examples about the nurture side of it. And it's not that she doesn't believe in nature. She just went through a bunch of biology beforehand and said, just how much we pass down through hereditary means in biological means. But now she really wants to focus on the environment, right? Because that's where we seem to either fail the child or support his potentialities. Sometimes there aren't a whole lot of things you can do on the nature side, on the biology side, but there are a lot of things you can do on the environmental side of things. So on page 57, she says, every personal trait absorbed by the child becomes fixed forever. And even if reason later disclaims it, something of it remains in the subconscious mind. For nothing that is formed in infancy can ever be wholly eradicated. The Mneme, which is, if you remember, that's that unconscious memory, the Mneme, that we may think of as a superior kind of memory, not only creates the individual's special characteristics, but also keeps them alive in him. What the child had absorbed remains a final ingredient of his personality. Does this remind you a little bit of Freud at the moment, that unconscious mind? If not, it probably should, because that's a big part of the Freudian theory. Now, how much of the Freudian theory you believe, how much you've studied, I would be interested to hear about that. So if you have a comment on Freud and the unconscious mind and what she's saying right here, please leave that below and I'd be happy to read it, because their psychology has come a long ways since then. So I'd be very interested to hear from others on their perspective of her theory and Freudian's theory at this point in time. On page 58, she says, the hope of altering the adult is therefore vain. And my question is, would somebody like a cognitive behavioral therapist agree? What does contemporary psychology think about that? It's definitely very difficult, right? I think we can all admit, man, if I had only just adapted or done something different earlier in life, it would have benefited me now as an adult. I think we can all agree on that, right? But to what extent? And can we alter an adult? There's a lot of dedication in the psychology and psychological realm right now, the modern psychology of retraining the mind, the way it thinks. So to what degree can we change an adult at this point in time? I'm not sure. I would love to hear your thoughts on that. But Montessori goes on to say the same thing explains man's adaptation to the various historical epochs. For while an adult of ancient times could not live in the world of our day, the child adapts to civilization at the level it has reached when he enters it. Whatever the level may be, he succeeds in making a man who can live there in conformity with its customs. So I've mentioned this in previous videos, that the child can adapt to any place in space or time, any culture, any civilization. The child can adapt, not so much the adult, right? We're kind of set in our ways. Even for me, when I lived in Florida and Kentucky, even that, it's really hard to adapt. Moving to a different state in the same country, it's hard to adapt. So we are kind of set in our ways by this point in time. So it's really a remarkable thing to say a child can adapt to any point in time, any place in history, and any civilization, any culture. It's a pretty mind-blowing concept when you think of it in the terms of it being that incredible, what they can do. And that's really part of that 0 to 6 age group. And I think this conversation becomes more relevant with modern society as we go along in this chapter. I'll have a few more questions that I'll throw at you in terms of how modern society is affecting the mindset of the child, that capability, that the potentiality of the child in that 0 to 6 environment. It's still a very relevant question to talk about and phenomenon to talk about. And I think we're only just now noticing how relevant it is. On page 58, she says, today the child must be considered as a point of union, a link joining the different epochs of history, the different levels of civilization. Infancy is a period of true importance because when we want to infuse new ideas, to modify or better the habits and customs of a people, to breathe new vigor into its national traits, we must use the child as our vehicle. To influence society, we must turn our attention to childhood. And this is really important. So my question for you right now is, how do you see this idea unfolding in current day society? Do you believe it's true? And my other question is, how are adults using this knowledge to influence society currently? And I think this is an important question because I think what we see right now is that people are incredibly aware of what she is saying right here. That if we want to influence society, we must turn our attention to childhood. And there are a lot of changes taking place in early childhood education. There are a lot of changes taking place in the education that you see at the younger levels and what they want to teach at the younger levels. Because they know if you want to influence society, you have to turn your attention to childhood. The adult, it's too late to change their mind for the most part, right? We're pretty much set. Now, that's not to say you can't change your mind as an adult. I've gone through evolutions of thought as an adult from my childhood, but not anything extreme, right? There's a little more perspective I've gained throughout the years of saying, okay, well, I was maybe a little too idealistic when I was younger. Maybe I need to have a more realistic thought. But if you want to change society, well, you really have to get to that 0 to 6 age group. And my question is, if that 0 to 6 age group is in the hands of somebody with good intentions, then good things happen. And if the 0 to 6 age group is in the hands of somebody with a detrimental agenda or damaging ideas, then we're leaving that group of children incredibly vulnerable to misuse and abuse. And I think that we're really in this battle or this war right now, not just within the United States, but all over the world for the 0 to 6 age group. And whether or not you want to call it a war, I think it is, because we are now negotiating of how we're going to influence the 0 to 6 age group, and parents are responding in a lot of different ways. So it's a hot topic. I'm not going to get too into it here, but I would love to hear your comments down below, just as long as they're respectful. Everybody can have their own say as long as they're respectful. And always, it's good to explain why you think something is the way it is. So I'd love to hear your thoughts below. And on page 59, Dr. Montessori says, the immense influence that education can exert through children has the environment for its instrument. Let me say that again. The immense influence that education can exert through children has the environment for its instrument. For the child absorbs his environment, takes everything from it, and incarnates it in himself. So again, my question is there anything being introduced into education currently during those 0 to 6 years that has immense influence on children and maybe changing society? What do you see it being? What are those topics? I'm not going to get into those topics here, but I'm going to just pose that question to you and let you think about that. And also, if a child can absorb everything without discrimination, like a sponge, and I referred to this on other videos of Montessori's view of the absorbent mind being a sponge. A sponge, if put into clean water, will absorb the clean water. A sponge put into dirty water will absorb the clean water and the dirty water. It cannot discriminate. So, what attitudes or beliefs from adults might the child be absorbing during the 0 to 6 age group? And can a child absorb a parent's desire for a different gender child? As we go along in this chapter, this question might become even more relevant. Because if a parent looks at their child and says, oh, I got a boy, I really wish I had a girl, how does that affect the child's development, right? And I think we all know at least one or two parents that had to struggle with the gender of whatever child they had at birth. And can a child absorb that attitude? Can they absorb that disappointment? And if you read The Absorbent Mind, I think the answer would be yes. But do you believe that, right? I think that would be something that Maria Montessori would say yes, that it would definitely happen. And I'm going to lay out more information why I think that she would say that, because she makes some very clear examples in this book. And if I'm not going to include all the examples in this book that she listed, but feel free to read it on your own. But I will list particularly one towards the end, example of how that early experience for an infant really does or potentially could affect their development. Continuing on page 59, she says, the question naturally arises as to when in the embryonic life, mental life could be said to start. As we know, a child is sometimes born at 7 months instead of at 9. And at 7 months, he is already complete enough to be able to live. So his psyche must be able to function. This serves to show my meaning when I maintain that all life is psychic. And again, what does she mean by psychic? She says it's the mental life, the mysteriousness of how the mind operates beyond the physical observations of function. That's how I take what she's saying by psychic here. And then she goes on to say, yet the baby, till quite a short time ago, was credited with having no mental life, and only recently have mental traits of his, previously not noticed, but admitted to the scientific picture. And so my question would be, is this still a debate? Are we still debating this? And I would say, yes, to some degree we are. We're actually at a time period where this is a very important debate, because we're not just debating when an infant is able to survive physically. We're now questioning, well, when does mental life begin? When does spiritual life begin? And all of this is getting tied into, of course, the Roe versus Wade debate, which is going through the Supreme Court right now, whether or not they're going to reverse that decision. And so while we have learned a lot about infancy and development in the womb, I think these debates that we're having right now still are very important to what Montessori is saying right here on page 59. On page 60, she says, to be forced to adapt suddenly to an environment totally different from the one in which he has been living, to be obliged to assume on-the-spot functions never before exercised, and to do this in the unspeakably exhausted state in which he finds himself. This is the hardest and most dramatic test in the whole of a man's life. So say modern psychologists who have coined the phrase birth terror to indicate this critical and decisive moment in the child's mental life. We are not, of course, dealing with a conscious fear, but if the child's mind could speak, it would find words like this to convey the situation. Why have you thrown me into this dreadful world? What shall I do? How can I live in this way? And so this idea of birth terror right here that she's talking about is an important concept in Montessori, that this process of being born, she says it's a good thing we can't remember it, but even though we can't consciously remember it, it is woven into our personality. It is woven into who we become. It's woven into our creative development as a human. So we might not be able to remember it, but yet our body can't forget it either. So it's an interesting thought, isn't it? The idea of birth terror. And what do you think about that? It's an interesting thought for sure. I can imagine that a child going through the process of birth is also experiencing a lot of drama, just as much as maybe the mother does, only the mother gets to remember it all. From pages 60 to 61, she says, the child is unaware of what has happened. He could not know he was suffering the pangs of birth, yet there must remain in his soul some mark, even if unconscious. He feels in his subconscious mind, and vents in his cry, something of what I have tried to express. So those working in this field find it natural to believe that ways must exist of helping the child to make his first adaptation to the world. Let us not forget that the tiniest babies are able to experience fear. And then she goes on to compare humans to the animal kingdom, and she talks about the protective measures and behaviors of animal mothers to help their babies survive and adapt. And she goes on to talk about instincts versus human tendencies, which I've talked about in previous videos, that according to Montessori, animals have instincts, whereas humans, we don't really have instincts. We have human tendencies, and we have those potentialities that allow us to develop further. So we're different than the animal kingdom. And again, back to the first part of the chapter where she talks about looking at our differences, it's what separates us as a species. So on page 62, she says, what is now taking place is a kind of awakening of potential powers. These will have the task of directing the huge creative work to be done by the child by the spiritual embryo. So these potential powers right here, that really comes into play after birth. And they have this huge creative work of constructing oneself, of constructing their personality, their will, all those different mental organs, all have to be done after birth. But the structures are put in place in the womb, the physical structures, but that creative work is done after birth. And that's what we're talking about in the spiritual embryo. And she says, so what we have to bear in mind is not only the trauma of birth, but also the possibility or otherwise of setting and train those activities which must necessarily follow it. For although no definite forms of behavior are pre-established in the child, as they are in the animals, he must nevertheless possess the power to create a behavior. There will be no atavistic memories to guide him, but the child will nevertheless experience nebulous urges without form, yet charged with potential energy. And these will have the duty of directing and incarnating in him the form of human conduct, which he finds in his surroundings. So here we're starting to talk about that key word, the nebulae. And just a reminder, the nebulae corresponds to the awakening of what are called behavior instincts in the animals. And it happens in those first few days of life. And those are the potentialities right there, all the potentialities. So he hasn't done anything with those potentialities yet, and he hasn't interacted with the environment. He's just been born. Those potentialities are there and unfulfilled. So that's where we're at with the spiritual embryo, where the child is at when he is born. On page 63, she says, the child, after he is born, has to incorporate into his life all these practices of his social group. Instead of being born possessed of them, he has to absorb them from outside himself. The vital task of infancy is the work of adaptation, which takes the place of the hereditary behavior patterns present in the animal embryos. He has no awakening of instincts as the newly born animals have in the first stage of their contact with the world. So an animal has an awakening of instincts, but the child has this awakening of potentialities. So there's a difference there. She says there is nothing fixed beforehand. He will have to make for himself all man's mental life and all the motor mechanisms, which are its means of expression. There are psychic patterns of behavior which have to be laid down before he begins to move. Thus, the starting point of infantile mobility is not motor, but mental. That mental component has to become first, right? And then comes the mobility. On pages 63 to 64, Montessori says, when the child is born, his organs themselves are not finished. The skeleton is far from ossified. The motor nerves are not yet provided with their covering of myelin, which isolates them from one another and enables them to transmit the brain's orders. Therefore, the body remains inert, as if it were the design for a body, roughly sketched in. And I find that to be a really interesting thought, right? We have this outline of a person, but it's a rough sketch. We're really filling it in. Those first few days of life are so important. That spiritual embryo, that child, is beginning to bring everything together and fill it in. On page 64, she says, now, The child's growth consists of many parts, all of them following a fixed order because they obey a common law. Never can education or exercise set other limits to this possibility. By becoming mature, the motor organs offer themselves little by little to the commands of the mind, and this can then make them move in indeterminate ways so as to gain experience in the environment. And this idea of experiencing the environment and the mind directing the movement is a very important concept in Montessori, and it's what we spend a lot of time with in the 3 to 6 age group when we plan what activities we're going to show the child, when we show specific lessons. It's really about the mind and the body connecting more. It's about how does the physical skills develop and connect with the mind for the development of the will and independence. So this is a very important concept right here. She goes on to say, by means of these experiences and these exercises, the child's movements become coordinated. And finally, his will can use them for its purposes. Man, unlike the animals, is not born with movements already coordinated. He has to shape and coordinate his own movements. And this is really fundamental for the 3 to 6 age group. And when we have a child who comes in at 2.5 to 3 years old, a lot of the time, what we're focusing on is that control and coordination of movement, and all the activities that the child is experiencing in the room really are geared with that focus in mind, as well as bringing order to his senses. We have an entire area called the sensorial area, which is all about the refinement of all the senses in the child's body. And then we also have the control and coordination of movement. On page 65, she says, man, instead, brings no abilities with him into the world. Yet his gifts are unsurpassed in the learning of movements. Of skilled movements, he can acquire the most varied imaginable. And if any of you have watched American Ninja Warrior, you're going to say, yes, that's true. It's unbelievable. When I watch American Ninja Warrior, I'm like, holy cow, how is that even possible? And then I think, well, I am well over the age of 6. I'm not sure that my control and coordination of movement was very well executed when I was little. Maybe that had something to do with it. Maybe it also has something to do with nature and biology, and maybe I just wasn't made to move that way, right? But she goes on to say, but none of these things come from a mere ripening of the organs of movement. It is always a matter of experience and action, of practice. In other words, of education. Every person is the author of his own skills, yet the physical constitution with which he starts is the same. It is the man himself who produces his own perfection. For in man, as we have seen, the mental side develops first. But when organs come into action, further mental development begins to occur, but always with the aid of movements made in the course of environmental experience. So that's the order that we think about when we're talking about Montessori and the development of movement. And the movement affects the mind, and then the mind affects the movement, and it goes together. So the mind and movement is this really, putting those two things together is a really important part of that 3 to 6 environment. It's something that we focus a lot on, and partly because there's that sensitivity for movement in the 0 to 6 age group, because one of the sensitive periods is the refinement of movement. On page 65, she says, if a child is prevented from using his powers of movement as soon as they are ready, this child's mental development is obstructed. Although mental development has no limits, it depends in great part on being able to use its instruments of action. So here we're talking about those windows of opportunities, those sensitive periods. And just a reminder, the sensitive periods are language, order, refinement of the senses, refinement of movement. Those have windows of opportunities in the 0 to 6 age group. And if you miss those opportunities to develop according to the potentials there, it doesn't come around again later on in life. And so these potentialities will not be fulfilled to their greatest extent. And that's why it's really important to understand when your child is moving all the time. I remember my dad calling me a mountain climber all the time because I had to climb everything, right? I'm definitely not a mountain climber now that I'm an adult. I'm not athletic. But at the same time, my parents kept on thinking, oh my goodness, she just climbs over everything. Well, before the age of 6, we have that need for movement. And Maria Montessori says children follow the law of maximum effort, and adults follow the law of minimum effort. If you go back to the example of American Ninja Warrior, even though it's insane what they can do they follow the law of minimum effort? When they're getting through that course, you could say yes, because they're looking at what technique is going to follow through the course that gives them the most efficiency. So they're still thinking in terms of minimum effort, right? They're like, okay, how do I know I'm going to have enough energy to make it through this entire course without running out of steam? So I would say it's still true. Even when you have these insane athletes, we still have this idea of, I need to conserve energy. A child doesn't have that. A child is full out, I have to put in the maximum effort. If there's an obstacle course I can create on my way from point A to point B, I need to do that, because nature is telling me I have to refine these skills. I have to refine my movement. And if I don't, I'm not going to fulfill all my potentialities. The child doesn't consciously know that, but that is the law of nature. That is how we are created. And this goes true for children in any culture. This is not something that was just found in Italy when Maria Montessori was first beginning her practice, right? This isn't just for American kids who need more exercise. No, this is for all children everywhere. And on page 66, she says, in the period, there is nothing we can do but help life to unfold. In this period of the spiritual embryo is what she's referring to. All we can do is help life unfold. And this happens in the same way for all. For all, there is a first of adaptation. For all, it is the mental side which initiates the adventure of life. Remember, she keeps saying that the mental part happens before the physical part. So that has to happen first. And if this period is helped in conformity with the requirements of human life, to that degree will each one benefit by being better able later on to develop his individual capacities. And so here she's saying we need to support this period early on. We need to support those sensitive periods, those windows of opportunities. And we need to be very protective of that spiritual embryo, that child in those first few days of life, who is all of a sudden absorbing everything around them. She says, hence, there can only be one way of educating and treating the tiny infant. If education is to begin at birth, there can be only one kind of education at that time. We can only speak of one method, that which follows the natural unfolding of man. All babies have the same psychological needs and follow the same sequence of events in attaining to human stature. So here we're talking about there can only be one way of doing this, right? There are not variations of how human infants developed. They all follow this sequence. We have to have that same type of education for any child born in any country, at any place in history. It's the same thing. We have that absorbent mind, and we have that spiritual embryo. So all of those happen regardless of space, time, culture, society, any of that. And on page 67, she says, she starts talking more about regressions and the Freudian view of development, which was becoming very popular at the time, and it is still popular nowadays, right? And we talk a lot about regressions, repression, regression. We talk about all of that because all of us have taken a Psychology 101 class, and so we love to use the word regressions. It's just become almost common language at this point for parents and for teachers. And she says symptoms of regression are related to birth trauma, while repression is related to circumstances later on. So if we're talking about the child not developing, and we're not really seeing a reason as to why they're not developing, it could be that she's suggesting there could be birth trauma that went on there. And I actually remember this story that Dr. Dubovoy told during my training about an infant who was born And the parents had shared shared the video of the child being born and said that she could talk about it. And she talked about when this child was uh, just a few hours old. The father was talking about, the sucking reflex, right, for latching on for feeding. And so the nurse took her finger and showed the father. Now the nurse was wearing a plastic glove, showing the father that there's a natural reflex there that the child will use when they begin to feed, which is why we usually stick the pacifier in, get that reflex going, right? Well, a piece of the glove broke off, and ever since then, that child was never able to breastfeed. That child was never, it had a lot of eating issues. And so and when you go back and look at those first few hours of experience and just how prominent they are, you can see even directly after that birth process, that birth trauma, like the child's just come through this intense process of being born, and then something having to do with a natural reflex is affected negatively, and the child didn't develop well with eating later on. And so that's what we're talking about here, that sensitivity after birth. That's really what I want you to get out of this right now, is that the regressions that take place from birth trauma and that time, that process right at birth is is still very connected to how we behave later on in life. So she wants to emphasize the fact that regressions and repressions are not the same thing, and that repressions happen later on. There can be a circumstance later on, like maybe the child has a negative experience in using the toilet and then becomes nervous of using the toilet again, right? That's not birth trauma, and that's totally different. That's a circumstance later on, so that would be more of a repression. And so she goes on to say birth trauma causes the child to develop in abnormal ways. The result is a psychic change, or rather a deviation of the psychic forces. And if you're going into AMI training, deviation is an important term that we'll use later when we talk about normalization, deviation, fugues, barriers, all that stuff. We'll get into all that good stuff later on. So if you're interested in the word deviation there, we'll come back to it later on. And she says, these children give the impression of still being attached to the state of affairs before birth. So there's just a little bit of information there. What do you think of that? If you're somebody who's given birth, or you're just somebody who's really interested in psychology and that time right after birth, what do you think of all this? Is this, there seems to be a lot of evidence that supports it. But I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts, or maybe some of the stories you have related to this phenomenon as well. On page 68, she says, the importance of sleep is something that we have to keep in mind. She says, for in sleep and not in realities, for in sleep and not realities. In sleep, there is life without the need for struggle. Sleep is a place for refuge, a withdrawal from the world. The position of the body in sleep is also to be noted. And then she goes on to give some examples of how infants sleep and what the connection of sleep to healthy development is. And do you think this is still true? What are your thoughts on a child that sleeps too much or too little, especially right after birth? Do you have any thoughts on that and the importance of sleep? What about children in the 0 to 6 age group? What do you think about the sleep there? So she does talk about the importance of sleep and what it can signify for development. And I'd be, again, very interested to hear what your thoughts are on this, but I'm not going to go much deeper into that. She says, later in life, regression may show itself a tendency to cling to others. The child might not like going out. Everything in the world that ought to make him happy fills him with alarm, and he has a revulsion for surroundings. So later on, we can see these things happening that we would call a deviation. He doesn't like going out. He clings to one or two people and can't seem to move away from them. Things that ought to make him happy, he's scared of all the time, right? Now, there are periods when, like, a 2-year-old starts having those night terrors and everything, right? Then those are pretty natural. Those are pretty consistent. And if you're dropping off your child at childcare and you mention this to the teacher, they'll probably say, oh, yes, that too, that's pretty normal. And so it's possible you might see some stuff going on then. That's not uncalled for. That's pretty normal at this point in time. But we're really talking about a child who's just not adapting to the world, right? And that's what she's talking about right here. And on page 69, she says, with our conscious memory, we forget. But the unconscious does something worse. For impressions made at this level are handed over to the Mneme. They become graven on the personality itself. So remember, Mneme is that unconscious memory. And she said it's worse than unconscious because it becomes a part of us. It's built into us. Our body knows that it happened, even though our mind does not. And we still behave as though it happened, even though our mind can't consciously remember. And so if this also sounds very Freudian to you, there's a reason for that. It is very Freudian. So she says it produces interchanges which become obstacles to the individual's life and personalities who impede the progress of the world. So this is going to become an obstacle. And the word obstacle is a really important term in the Montessori environment, because when we talk about the child developing and there is an abnormality to the way that they're developing or to the way that they're going about their day, we look at what obstacles are in the child's way, what obstacles have been put into the child's path that they cannot seem to get around. And that's an important concept that we look at when we're looking at what's going on inside the classroom or what might be going on at home. She says, we see how necessary it is that we should both give importance to the child's adaptation to his world and also remember the shock of his birth, for this shows us that he also needs special treatment just as much as the mother. And I'm going to give a little bit of context for modern society here, because we're doing a lot of different things now with birth. And not just affecting birth terror, but really before birth, because now science can do a lot of different things, right? Science can do, you can do IVF, fertility treatments, all sorts of different things, implantations, all these different types of scientific techniques to have children. And so it's really an interesting development that children are being brought into this world, and then a mother could just be a surrogate, right? Not the biological mother of the child, but just someone who gives birth. And so how does that affect everything as well? And so when you're thinking about these questions, don't just think about these questions in terms of what she's saying in the traditional sense, but also how might this affect or be affecting modern experiences, right? How would this affect what science is now developing for having children in our current day and age? And I don't really have any answers for that, but it's an interesting question to ask. And on page 70, she says, we have formulated the concept of the nebulae, likening the creative energies, which will guide the child to absorb from his environment to the starry nebulae from which the heavenly bodies take their origin. Again, nebulae being referred to as those potentialities and the creative energies that come with it. She says, so we can imagine the slow emergence of something not hereditary, yet produced by an instinctive tendency, which is hereditary. So the instinctive tendency is something that we inherit. However, the tendency, that emergence of whatever it is not hereditary, but the instinctive tendency is. And she goes on to give the example of language. And she says, the child receives from the nebulae of language, there's a little typo there, that's supposed to say language, suitable stimuli, and guidance for the formation in himself of his mother tongue. So we have this potentiality for language, right? So we're going to switch out nebula for potential. The potentiality of language. And that is what gives him his mother tongue. And that's not inborn in him, but something he finds in his environment and absorbs according to immutable laws. So we're following a law here. Thanks to the nebular energy, the potentiality of language, the child becomes able to distinguish the sounds of spoken language from other sounds and noises which reach him, all mixed together. Right? So this potentiality. The child doesn't know when they're born into this world, they really don't know what language their mother tongue is going to be. So if a child is born in Africa or China or Russia or anywhere else in the world and then comes to the United States, you know, he might hear the other language for a few days, but then the mother tongue becomes English. And then how does a child distinguish between all this? Why doesn't a child learn to communicate with a dog or a cat? They might enjoy barking or meowing at some point in their life, right? They really get into that. But that's not the way they speak. That's not the language they develop. They don't develop the language of the dog. They don't develop the language of the cat. They develop the language of the humans in their environment. And so they don't have any predetermination for the language that they're going to speak, because they can speak any of the language, but it has to be human language, right? That's what their potentiality is. And that potentiality is born within the child. But the language itself has to be created. And that's what she's talking about when she's talking about these created behaviors. The potentiality is there. The structure is there for it. But the child still has to create it within himself. The page 70 continued, she says, the nebula of language does not contain the special kind of language which the child is destined to develop. But from it, every language which he finds surrounding him at birth can be constructed, and each will develop itself in the same length of time and following the same procedure in all children in all the countries of the world. So the child, it is clear, does not inherit a pre-established model for his language, but he inherits the power of constructing a language by an unconscious activity of absorption. So that's a pretty powerful example of the potentiality of the child at birth. They're not, you know, a dog when they're born, they can speak dog and other dogs understand them. The child does not have that. The child has to create that, and that potentiality is born within the child. But that potentiality, if it's not given potential by the environment, if the environment does not support that potentiality, it disappears, right? It goes away. The child does not make use of it. And a great example of this that I always go back to is the wild child, Victor of Aveyron, which I always suggest if you are interested in, if you get through all of this and you're still interested in this topic, go watch the movie The Wild Child by Francois Truffaut. And I've suggested it before on this channel, and I think it's a really good example of the development of language, the development of the child who maybe misses those potentialities and those windows of opportunity. If they miss out on them on that 0 to 6 age group, what happens to that child later on? And some of that example is really shown in the story of Victor, the wild child, who was a feral child found in France. And Itard, who came before Montessori, worked with him on developing language and helping him learn. So it's a really interesting story. So anyways, I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. So let's continue on here. Page 71, she says, to us, the mental organism is a dynamic whole, which transforms its structure by active experience obtained from its surroundings. It is guided thereto by an energy, and that energy we're going to call the Horme, of which the nebulae are differentiated and specialized kinds or stages. We got this Horme, this creative energy that's coming into play here. And the nebulae, that's the potentiality. That becomes, we have those specialized kinds or stages. So she says, let us imagine that the nebula for language did not function or remain latent for some unknown reason. The language would not develop. This abnormality, which is not unusual, produces a form of mutism in children who are perfectly normal in the organs of speech and in hearing, and whose brains are also normal. It would be interesting to examine these cases and to investigate what had taken place in the first days of life of these unfortunates. So again, we do have a lot of examples here about language and that potentiality, because it's one that it's easy to recognize. We have children who can hear. Their organs of speech and their organs of hearing are perfectly normal. Their intelligence is perfectly normal, yet they do not speak. And for some reason, that potentiality didn't develop. So it's a really interesting idea to follow that through. On page 72, she says, I hold that many regressive tendencies are due to a lack of the vital urge. That vital urge, which guides the child to make his social adaptation. In these cases, the child, for lack of the proper sensitiveness, does not absorb anything from his environment or makes an imperfect absorption. Not feeling attraction but revulsion, he fails to develop what is called a love for the environment, from which he should gain his independence by a series of conquests over it. And here I did underline love for the environment. Love for the environment is an important concept in Montessori, and the child should want to conquer his environment, right? And we'll get into a little bit later when we start talking about deviations and normalization. We're also going to talk about the weak child and the strong child. And a child that has a love for his environment wants to have that conquest over it and become independent. But what happens when that doesn't happen, right? That'll be answered in a different chapter. We'll go into that. I don't know if it's so much of an answer, but we will explore that in a different chapter in the Absorbent Mind. And so Montessori goes on to say, man possesses creative sensitivities instead of hereditary models of behavior. So we have these creative sensitivities, these potentialities, and it is due to these that adaptation occurs to his surroundings. Then it is clear that the whole psychic life of the individual stands upon a foundation which is laid down by them in the earliest years, more specifically, the 0 to 6 environment. And so this is why when you're looking at where you're going to place your child in the 0 to 6 environment, whether or not you're going to keep them home, take them to childcare, go into a private setting like Montessori or do Head Start or whatever your options you're looking at right now, it's a really big decision, isn't it? And if you're kind of feeling the weight of it at the moment of just how much of an impact the environment your child experiences in that 0 to 6 environment, I understand if you might be having an anxiety attack right now because it's pretty important. But nobody's perfect, so I hope that helps put that into perspective right there. Nobody's perfect, right? And the child is born with a lot of potentialities, and there is a lot that the child can make up for in that 0 to 6 age group, right? But those windows of opportunity, those sensitive periods, those won't come again, and the child will have to work harder to learn later on how to start making up for what they may have missed in those windows of opportunity. And also, if you do watch the movie The Wild Child by Francois Truffaut, there are a lot of things that Victor was able to do that he wasn't able to do before. Now, did he reach the potentialities that he would have had he had a better environment, or if he wasn't a feral child left to the wilderness in that 0 to 6 environment? No, he did not reach all those potentialities. But was he influenced and affected by Itard's work with him? Absolutely. And I'm not going to talk too much more about the movie. You should go watch it. If you're interested in his story. There's also books as well. I haven't read the books. I've only watched the movie. So, there's a lot that can be done nowadays, and we're learning a lot about brain development. So I don't want you to freak out too much, but also just keep in mind that, this really is an important time to think about what environment you want your child to be in, because they don't just experience an environment, they absorb it. Page 72 continue, she says, but now we must ask ourselves, are there any causes to which we may attribute a delayed or missing awakening of these creative sensitivities? To this question, no answer can yet be made. So this is where she's getting into that gray area of, okay, so there in some children, these are delayed or missing creative sensitivities that just didn't awaken in the child, or they awaken later on. So what's going on with that here? And she says, well, that's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. And she gives an example. She says, at the moment, I have only known one case which may suggest a line of investigation. It was that of a young man incapable of discipline and of application to study, a difficult boy with a bad character which made him intractable and condemned him to isolation. Wow, that's pretty intense right there. And she goes on to say, he was good looking, healthy, and also intelligent. She said, but he had suffered in his first 15 days of life a severe malnutrition. The wet nurse who was sent for to feed him thought him disgusting. After the first 2 weeks and for the rest of his life, he developed normally. But the youth he became was predestined to crime. That is a pretty intense story right there, right? So we have this difficult boy, this bad character, and he goes on to this life of crime. But let's keep in mind, if we're to look back at when he suffered birth trauma and also suffered in the first 15 days the severe malnutrition. So, okay, that's a lot of physical trauma right there. But at the same time, he experienced this absorption of negative feelings from the woman taking care of him and thought him disgusting. And so when we're talking about what's going on with children nowadays, we are starting to see that the experience of birth and right after birth, it stays with us. We don't ever really outgrow that. We might not remember it, but we don't forget it. And finally, last slide, page 73. She says, our aim is to establish a principle of special importance to intelligent mothers and to the home in general. There must come into being a special code of rules, exacting and precise, for the treatment of the child at birth and in the first few days following birth. And I thought that was an excellent quote to end the last slide on. And this chapter, I think, would be a great chapter to have somebody who's trained in the Assistance to Infancy certification, that we call it the A to I. That's the 0 to 3 certification in AMI. This would be a great chapter to bring in somebody who's trained in that period, because this is really their sweet spot right here. And for me, I'm really dealing with what happens when the child becomes 2.5 to 3 years old. So a lot has happened in the child's life when I get them at 2.5 to 3 years old. And we're seeing a lot of things now that we're going back and we're still asking questions about, what were these children's first few days of life like, right? And I've even heard it said by, I want to say, an occupational therapist. And now I don't know if this is true. This is not advice. This isn't something I can claim scientifically is true. But, I've heard that for C-sections and IVF, children born through that may possibly have, more sensory issues. And I don't know if that's true, but if that is true, it's an interesting line of thought to think about, right? Like, how do we respond to a child who is born in a way that is less traditional? And what therapies might they need? And can we prepare or predict those therapies that might be needed? All of these are questions that we have to ask modern science, because we're doing things differently, right? Every time you do something different, and it affects how a child is born and how the child experiences the first few days of life after birth. These are questions we have to ask, and more so we have to really ask, what is the child absorbing in the environment between the ages of 0 to 6? And what do we want the child absorbing in the environment between the ages of 0 to 6, right? And this is really, I think, weighing heavily on the hearts of parents and teachers right now in the United States, and possibly, I'm sure, throughout the world right now. So I'm going to leave it here for right now. I'm going to put chapters in so that you can skip around to the different concepts in this chapter. It's a big chapter. I know there was a lot here. It's kind of a heavy chapter with a lot going on, but I still would be really interested in any of your comments. So make a comment down below if you've got something to say. And if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up, share it with somebody. And of course, as always, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you can catch my videos later on. And I will see you in the next video.